My name is Arya. I am 21 years old, and until the night of my father's death, I believed loyalty still existed in this world. My family had built its empire on trust, on promises whispered in boardrooms and sealed with handshakes that were meant to last forever. But all of it was an illusion, a fragile glass castle shattered by the greed of those closest to us. That night, as the rain hammered against the windows of our estate, I overheard voices that turned my blood cold. My uncle and my cousin, men I had grown up with, plotting to seize everything. The money, the property, even the legacy my father had spent his life protecting. And when my father collapsed at his desk, betrayed by the very people he had trusted, they didn't mourn. They celebrated, as if his death was their victory. I stood in the shadows, broken but unseen, and in that moment, something inside me changed forever. I was no longer the fragile daughter they dismissed, no longer the quiet girl they thought powerless. I became the storm they could not predict. Every tear I shed that night hardened into resolve. Every heartbeat echoed with the same vow. I would not rest until I took back everything they stole, until I destroyed them piece by piece, using the very weapons they thought made them untouchable. The empire they believed was theirs would be the empire I would rebuild, not as a victim, but as the hand of reckoning they never saw coming. The morning after my father's death, the house smelled of lilies and lies, the air heavy with the whispers of relatives pretending to mourn, while the very men who orchestrated his fall stood at the center, shaking hands, offering comfort, and wearing faces painted with false grief. My uncle, now suddenly the pillar of the family, spoke of responsibility and duty, declaring that he would guide us through these dark times. But I could see the gleam in his eyes, the satisfaction of victory he thought hidden. My cousin, arrogant as ever, brushed past me with a smirk, already speaking as if the wealth and power were his birthright, as if my father's legacy had simply fallen into his lap. They had no idea that I had overheard their midnight conversation. No clue that the quiet girl in the corner was no longer silent, no longer broken. That day, I began collecting information. Documents, passwords, hidden files that my father had carefully secured in case betrayal ever came, because deep down, he must have known it would. Each page I read was a weapon, each ledger a blueprint, for dismantling the empire they believed was theirs. I didn't lash out. I didn't scream. I let them believe I was grieving, let them underestimate me, because invisibility was my greatest shield. And as I stood beside my father's casket, my tears were real. But beneath them burned the beginning of my revenge, a plan that would start small, in silence, but would grow into something so unstoppable that when it struck, it would not just wound, it would annihilate. Weeks passed, and my uncle and cousin grew bolder, parading through the estate as if they had been kings all along, their laughter echoing down the marble halls that once carried my father's voice. I stayed quiet, studying them, learning their patterns, listening to their late-night conversations that reeked of greed and arrogance. My cousin bragged constantly about a new business deal, one that would seal their control and prove to the world that the empire was his now. He thought I wasn't listening when he left his phone carelessly, unlocked, but that was his first mistake. Hidden among his arrogant texts and emails was the name of their partner, a man with a reputation for ruthlessness, but also a well-known weakness, his obsession with secrecy. Using my father's encrypted files and the contacts he had trusted, with me alone, I crafted a simple but devastating move, a leak of just enough information to cast doubt on my cousin's loyalty. The partner panicked, believing he was being set up, and within days, the deal collapsed, leaving my uncle furious and my cousin humiliated. I watched from the shadows as they argued, pointing fingers, their alliance already cracking under the pressure of one failed venture. And though I never spoke a word, I felt a cold satisfaction ripple through me. It was small, yes, but it was the beginning. For the first time, they had tasted failure, and they didn't even know it was me who had fed it to them. They thought I was grieving, harmless, invisible. But I was already inside their walls, tearing down the foundation brick by brick. The nights grew longer, and so did my hunger for the truth. My uncle had always carried himself as the family savior, a man of dignity in the eyes of outsiders, but behind the polished smile and expensive suits, he hid rot that spread like poison through every corner of our lives. I began spending hours in my father's old study, where his hidden safes and coded journals lay waiting, as if he had left them behind for me to find. With trembling hands but a steady heart, I cracked open files that revealed decades of my uncle's betrayals, secret accounts hidden overseas, properties stolen from loyal friends, and bribes paid to silence those who dared to oppose him. The more I read, the more the pieces of his empire looked like a castle built on bones and lies. My father had known, but he was too honorable to strike his own blood. I, however, had no such mercy left inside me. One night, as the storm raged outside, I crept into my uncle's office, my footsteps muffled by the thunder, and copied every incriminating document I could find. Emails, forged contracts, even proof of the debts he owed to dangerous men who would not forgive betrayal. Each file I gathered was more than evidence. It was power. And as I slipped back into my room with a flash drive full of his darkest secrets, pressed against my chest, I felt no fear, only the certainty that I was no longer powerless. My uncle thought he was untouchable, that his sins were buried in shadows. But I was the shadow now, and I was ready to make him bleed from within. The perfect mask my uncle wore began to splinter the moment I released my first strike into the world. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. It was a whisper disguised as coincidence, a shadow passing through the halls of power. A single anonymous email, attached with forged-looking contracts and a hint of scandal, was all it took to plant doubt in the minds of his closest business allies. Men who once raised their glasses to toast his success now lowered their eyes in suspicion, whispering questions behind his back. At a lavish dinner, I sat silently in the corner, pretending to mourn still, while I watched him struggle to explain away the sudden tension in the room, the subtle withdrawal of trust. One man excused himself early. Another refused to sign the deal that had seemed certain only a week before. My cousin fidgeted nervously, sensing the shift but too arrogant to realize the source. The empire they had stolen from my father was beginning to wobble, not from an earthquake, but from small tremors that I alone controlled. My uncle's face twitched with barely hidden fury as his allies pulled away, his wine glass shaking slightly in his hand as he tried to maintain composure. No one else noticed, but I did. I saw the fear creeping into his eyes, the cracks forming in his crown, and though no one suspected me, I felt the rush of power course through my veins. For the first time, the mighty man who thought himself untouchable was standing on unsteady ground. My cousin had always been reckless, arrogant, and hungry for validation, the kind of man who believed his youth and charm could excuse every mistake. He craved admiration, flaunted wealth that wasn't his, and surrounded himself with sycophants who cheered his every careless move. That arrogance was my weapon. Using the files I had stolen, I discovered one of his biggest secrets: a gambling addiction that bled money into the pockets of dangerous men. With a few carefully timed messages, sent from an untraceable account, I fed his weakness, tempting him into a high-stakes game that was rigged from the start. He fell for it eagerly, blinded by pride, desperate to prove himself as more than just his father's puppet. Within nights, he had lost a fortune, money that was not his to lose, money tied directly to one of their most delicate business accounts. I waited for the perfect moment to strike, and then I leaked evidence of his reckless spending to their investors. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Contracts were canceled, partnerships dissolved, and whispers spread that the golden boy was nothing more than a liability. My uncle tried to cover it up, throwing his weight and influence into silencing the rumors, but the damage was already done. For the first time, my cousin's smug smile cracked, replaced by the haunted eyes of a man who had lost more than he could ever repay. Watching him squirm, watching the once untouchable heir stumble so publicly, filled me with a quiet satisfaction. I didn't need to strike him with fists or fire. I had made him collapse under the weight of his own sins. For so long, I had moved in silence, a ghost haunting their empire. But after my cousin's public humiliation, I tasted something new. Power. It wasn't loud or violent. It was the quiet thrill of pulling strings from the shadows and watching arrogant men dance without realizing who held the tune. For the first time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt inevitable. Yet even shadows need allies, and fate handed me one in the most unexpected way. Among my father's old contacts was a man named Elias, once a loyal advisor cast aside by my uncle when he refused to bow to corruption. I found him in a dim cafe far from the city's glittering skyline, his sharp eyes dulled by years of exile. At first, he looked at me with pity, assuming I was just a grieving daughter chasing ghosts. But when I revealed the documents I had collected, his expression changed. Shock, then disbelief, then something fierce sparking back to life. "You are your father's daughter," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and respect. That night, I gained more than an ally. I gained a mentor who knew my uncle's empire inside out, a man who could guide me through the labyrinth of lies with precision. As we walked away from the cafe, I felt the city lights burn brighter, not because they welcomed me, but because they feared the storm I was about to unleash. My uncle and cousin thought they had silenced every loyal voice, but they had overlooked one thing. The loyalty my father had inspired never truly died. It had only been waiting for me to claim it. With Elias by my side, the shadows grew sharper, the silence heavier, and my plan began to take shape with terrifying clarity. He mapped out the veins of my uncle's empire. Hidden shell companies, offshore accounts, puppet directors whose names appeared on paper but never in public. "Your uncle's power isn't his charm or his words," Elias told me as he spread the files across the table. "It's the money that flows through these channels. Cut off the flow, and the empire suffocates." For weeks, we worked in secret, creating fake leads, planting subtle errors in accounting records, and redirecting funds to trigger suspicion. The first strike was a carefully orchestrated bank audit, anonymous tips sent to the right officials at the right time. At first, my uncle dismissed it as routine, but when the investigation deepened, when whispers of fraud and tax evasion reached the ears of his elite circle, the mask of confidence he wore began to slip. I watched from across the ballroom during a gala as he tried to laugh off the rumors, but his eyes darted nervously, his hand tightening on the glass until it nearly shattered. Investors who once begged for his attention now hesitated to shake his hand. The empire that had seemed untouchable was bleeding, and every drop of doubt was my doing. My cousin raged like a cornered animal, throwing blame in every direction, but I remained invisible, their least suspect. As Elias leaned toward me, his voice low and calm, he whispered, "This is only the beginning. We've struck the nerve. Now we watch the body convulse." And as I looked at the trembling man who had once destroyed my family, I realized just how intoxicating revenge truly was. Every empire has pillars, and my uncle's strongest was Richard, Hale, a man who had stood by his side since their earliest ventures. Ruthless, loyal, and feared, Richard was more than an ally. He was the shadow that enforced my uncle's will when charm failed. But loyalty built on profit is fragile, and Elias reminded me that Richard valued one thing above all else: money. So I studied him, tracing his investments, his debts, and his vices, until I found the crack in his armor. Richard had poured millions into a secret project overseas, one my uncle had promised to back but quietly sabotaged to keep him dependent. Using the files in my possession, I crafted a story, one where Richard wasn't betrayed by circumstance, but by my uncle himself. A forged email, a leaked memo, and a carefully staged anonymous phone call later, the seed of doubt was planted. Richard's rage was immediate. At the next gathering, I stood at the edge of the crowd, invisible as always, and watched him confront my uncle with barely controlled fury. Their voices rose above the music, their words sharp as blades. For the first time, the room saw the cracks in their alliance, saw the mighty bond fracture under suspicion. My uncle's attempts at denial fell flat. His charm no longer blinded those who watched with eager eyes. And in that moment, as Richard stormed out, vowing retribution, I knew I had turned one of his greatest strengths into his greatest weakness. One by one, I would make his allies abandon him, until he stood alone, exposed, and trembling in the empire he had built from stolen blood. By now, my uncle's empire was no longer invincible. It was fragile, riddled with fractures, the once solid foundation trembling under the weight of secrets and betrayals. Yet he still carried himself like a king, strutting through boardrooms and ballrooms, refusing to acknowledge the storm gathering around him. That arrogance made me bold. Until now, I had been invisible, a ghost pulling strings. But I decided it was time to let him feel the brush of my presence, just enough to unsettle him, just enough to make him look over his shoulder at night. Using Elias's guidance, I crafted a warning so sharp and personal that it would haunt him. Late one evening, as my uncle prepared to leave his office, he found a single envelope resting on his desk. No name, no signature, only 3 words written, in my father's handwriting, perfectly forged. Debt is due. Inside the envelope were copies of the very documents he thought buried forever, evidence of bribes, fraud, and betrayal. But redacted, just enough to terrify him while leaving. The source a mystery, I watched from across the street as he read the letter, his face draining of color, his hands trembling despite his effort to remain composed. For the first time, he looked less like a ruler and more like prey. Yet the beauty of it was this. He didn't suspect me. He believed it was an enemy from his past, one of the many he had wronged, circling back to collect. And as he doubled his guards, made frantic calls, and lashed out at his own allies, I felt a dark satisfaction bloom inside me. He wasn't just losing power, he was losing peace, and that was only the beginning of his unraveling. My cousin had always been his father's pride, the heir to his stolen empire. But arrogance makes fools of men, and I intended to turn that arrogance into a blade. With Elias's help, I began feeding my cousin whispers through anonymous sources, rumors of secret opportunities, risky investments, and powerful allies who would support him if only he broke away from his father's shadow. At first he ignored them, but temptation gnawed at him. He was tired of being treated like a child, tired of living in his father's shadow while everyone whispered that he was incompetent. Soon, he took the bait. I watched with cold delight as he began secretly moving funds, forging signatures, and trying to cut private deals behind my uncle's back. But I made sure his tracks weren't hidden well enough. A few strategic leaks, a conveniently timed mistake in the paperwork, and the evidence fell directly into my uncle's hands. The confrontation that followed was volcanic. My uncle stormed into the study one evening, slamming documents onto the desk while my cousin stammered, unable to explain the trail of betrayal that pointed straight at him. Their shouting rattled the house, words like traitor, fool, and liability echoing down the halls. Servants whispered, allies took notice, and the once solid image of a united family cracked into jagged pieces. My cousin, humiliated and desperate, swore he had been set up. But my uncle's fury blinded him. He could no longer trust his own son, and suspicion began to fester between them like poison in the bloodline. And I, the invisible hand guiding their downfall, smiled in the shadows, because nothing destroys an empire faster than turning father against son. The day finally came when I was ready to move beyond whispers and cracks. I wanted an earthquake that would shake the empire to its knees. With Elias's guidance, We mapped out the most delicate artery of my uncle's wealth, a vast network of offshore accounts that fed into his businesses, hidden carefully to avoid taxes and scrutiny. One small disruption there would trigger suspicion, everywhere. Using forged documents, anonymous leaks, and the careful manipulation of banking systems, I made it appear as though a massive sum of money had been siphoned away by unknown hands. In truth, the money still sat untouched, but the illusion of loss was powerful enough to ignite panic. Within days, investors pulled out, partners demanded answers, and whispers of collapse and fraud raced through the markets. For the first time, the newspapers that once praised my uncle's brilliance now printed headlines questioning his empire's stability. At a public event, I watched him stand on stage, his usual confident speech trembling as reporters hurled questions about missing funds and collapsing deals. His smile faltered, his charm cracked, and behind the polished facade, the truth was clear. He was drowning. My cousin, desperate to prove his worth, tried to calm the storm, but only made it worse, fumbling through excuses that exposed their disarray. The mighty empire, built on blood and betrayal, was crumbling in full view of the world. And yet, no one saw me in the crowd. No one suspected the silent daughter who stood among them with a calm smile. Because while they were busy trying to stop the bleeding, I was already planning where to strike next, deep enough that this time they wouldn't recover. Money could be rebuilt, alliances could be mended, but reputation, once shattered, never returned to its original form. My uncle had worn a mask of dignity for decades, fooling the world into believing he was a man of honor, a family man, a self-made success. But I knew better. Buried deep in my father's journals and whispered, late-night conversations from my childhood was a truth only the family knew. My uncle's rise had not come from brilliance, but from betrayal. He had not just stolen my father's empire, he had orchestrated my aunt's mysterious accident, years ago, silencing the only woman who had dared to stand against him. With Elias's help, I gathered the fragments of this truth, medical records, hushed testimonies, even a hidden letter from my aunt that my father had kept locked away. I didn't throw everything into the light at once. I released it like venom, one drop at a time, through anonymous sources, each piece too sharp to ignore, too damning to dismiss. Soon the whispers spread beyond boardrooms into dinner tables, and headlines. The respected patriarch was, perhaps, a murderer. My uncle tried to laugh it off, calling it a smear campaign, but the doubt in people's eyes told another story. His friends avoided him, his allies kept their distance, and even the servants whispered as he passed, their respect turning to fear. I watched him rage alone in his study, smashing glasses, shouting into the empty air. No longer the untouchable king, but a man haunted by the ghosts of his sins. And for the first time, I didn't just attack his empire, I shattered the mask he had worn his whole life. The world now saw him not as a leader, but as a monster. By now, the cracks in their empire had widened into canyons, but I knew the final destruction wouldn't come from me alone. It would come from them tearing each other apart. My cousin still craved validation, desperate to reclaim dignity after his humiliations, while my uncle had grown paranoid, seeing betrayal in every shadow. All it took was a gentle push. Using the documents I had collected, I forged a trail of evidence suggesting that my cousin had been quietly feeding information to the authorities in exchange for immunity. It wasn't completely false. He had been reckless enough to make deals behind his father's back before. But this time, I made sure the proof looked undeniable. I leaked the evidence into my uncle's hands, just as I had planned. The eruption was volcanic. One night, the mansion's walls shook with shouts as my uncle stormed into his son's room, waving papers and screaming accusations of treachery. My cousin, caught off guard, swore innocence, but desperation made him lash out. For the first time, he screamed back, throwing his father's own crimes in his face, shouting truths he had buried for years. The argument spiraled into violence. Fists, Slammed on tables, glass shattered, doors slammed, until servants whispered in fear of what might come next. By morning, the house was divided. My uncle locked his son out of the family accounts, while my cousin, humiliated and furious, stormed off with threats of vengeance of his own. I watched from the shadows, unseen but everywhere, as father and son turned into enemies, each convinced the other was the traitor. And in that moment, I realized my greatest victory. I no longer needed to destroy them. They would destroy themselves, clawing at each other with the same ferocity they had once turned on my family. Blood had finally risen against blood, and all I had to do was watch the empire collapse under its own weight. The mansion that once felt like a fortress now resembled a battlefield. Doors slammed, hallways echoed with accusations, and silence hung heavy in the spaces between, the kind of silence that comes only before something breaks. My uncle, stripped of allies, now lived like a caged beast, pacing his study day and night, suspicious of every phone call, every glance. My cousin, banished from the accounts and cut off from his inheritance, began building his own network of desperate men, dealers, thugs, and investors who thrived in shadows. I had pushed them into this corner, but now they clawed at each other like wounded predators. And still, I wasn't finished. With Elias at my side, I began stitching together the final stage of my plan. A dossier, thick with every crime, every betrayal, every drop of blood they had spilled to build their empire. It was not just for the authorities. It was for the world, a weapon sharp enough to cut through lies and expose them for what they truly were. But I didn't release it yet. Timing was everything. Instead, I began to leak pieces, one to the press, one to a prosecutor, another to a rival hungry for their fall, each piece tightening the noose around their necks. My uncle and cousin, blinded by rage against each other, never noticed the walls closing in. They thought they were still fighting for control of the empire, still clinging to power, when in truth, I already held the strings. I had turned them into puppets, dancing violently toward their own destruction. And soon, with one final pull, the curtain would fall. The storm I had been patiently weaving finally broke into the open. My uncle and cousin, blinded by pride and poisoned by mistrust, had been clawing at each other in private. But I wanted the world to see their collapse. With Elias's help, I orchestrated a scandal so loud, so explosive, that no amount of money or influence could silence it. I took the forged contracts, the gambling debts, the bribes, and the whispers of murder, and I bound them together into one damning package. Then, at the perfect moment, I released it. Not quietly, not discreetly, but through the largest media channels, anonymous exposés, and even leaked recordings of father and son screaming at each other in the mansion. The effect was catastrophic. Headlines screamed betrayal, corruption, and blood-stained wealth. Investors abandoned them in waves, politicians they once owned turned their backs, and the public, hungry for scandal, tore into their family name like vultures over a carcass. My uncle raged on television, declaring it all lies, while my cousin, desperate to save himself, appeared in his own interview, subtly blaming his father and painting himself as the victim. Their war was no longer confined to gilded halls. It was broadcast to the world, every accusation, every fracture, every humiliation feeding the fire. The empire that once stood as a monument of power was now a circus of disgrace. And as I watched the chaos unfold on the glowing screens of the city, I felt no guilt, only a cold satisfaction. The world finally saw them for who they truly were. Not kings, not leaders, but monsters cannibalizing each other in a desperate bid to survive. What they didn't know, what no one suspected, was that it had been me all along, pulling every string, writing every headline. And soon, when the fire had consumed everything they thought was theirs, I would step out of the shadows, not just as the survivor of their betrayal, but as the executioner of their legacy. I had waited years for this moment, the silence, the whispers, the careful shadows all leading me here, to stand in front of the man who had destroyed my family and stolen everything that should have been mine. The scandal had ripped his empire apart. His allies had abandoned him. His son had turned into his enemy. And yet he still clung to the illusion of power, pacing his study like a king without a crown. When I walked into the room, he didn't recognize me at first. To him, I was still the quiet girl who lingered at the edges of his world, too fragile to matter. But when I laid the final dossier on his desk, proof of every crime, every betrayal, every secret he thought buried, his face drained of color, his eyes wide with the sudden, horrifying realization. "It was you," he whispered, his voice breaking between disbelief and rage. "All this time, it was you." I didn't flinch. I didn't smile. I only met his gaze with the calm certainty of someone who had already won. "Yes," I said, my voice steady, sharp, and final. "And I am only just beginning." The room was heavy with silence, broken only by the ticking of an antique clock that seemed to mock the tension between us. My uncle sat slumped in his chair, but his eyes burned with the venom of a man who had built an empire out of blood and lies, refusing to accept defeat, even as it dripped from every corner of his shattered legacy. "You think you've won, child?" he snarled, his voice a jagged whisper. "You've destroyed the family name, ruined the foundation that carried you. And for what? Revenge? You've made yourself into a traitor." I leaned closer, my voice soft but razor sharp, slicing through his delusions. "No, I've done what you never had the courage to do. I've ripped the rot out of the foundation. You think you built this empire, but all you built was a prison, one you locked us all inside." I broke the chains. His laugh was hollow, bitter, desperate. "Chains? Those chains gave you everything you have. The clothes on your back, the roof over your head. Without me, you'd be nothing but a forgotten girl in a forgotten story." I let his words settle before answering, my gaze unyielding. "Without you, I would have been free. With you, I learned how to fight, how to survive, and how to win. So you're right, Uncle. You made me. But what you didn't realize is that in making me, you created your own destruction." The clock ticked louder, echoing in the silence that followed, and for the first time, he had no reply. My cousin had always been his father's shadow, desperate for approval yet crushed beneath the weight of expectations he could never meet, and I knew that fragile hunger was the key to breaking. The last piece of my uncle's defense. I found him alone in the wreckage of their crumbling estate, drunk on anger and humiliation, his hands trembling as if he could still feel the jeers of the world that now mocked their once untouchable name. "He used you," I whispered, slipping into a spiral like poison in wine. "Every sacrifice you made, every deal you carried, every lie you told, it was never for you, it was always for him. And when the walls collapsed, did he protect you? Or did he let you burn while he screamed? For his own survival?" His silence was answer enough, the flicker of doubt I needed to twist the knife deeper. I painted a vision for him. One where he was no longer the failure of his father's empire, but the avenger of his own stolen dignity, a man who could rise if only he dared to turn against the tyrant who had chained him all his life. By the time I left, his hands no longer trembled with fear, but with rage, and in his eyes, I saw the storm I had been waiting for. A son ready to destroy his father, unaware that in doing so, he was also finishing my war for me. The confrontation came like a thunderstorm no one could escape. My cousin stormed into the study where his father sat brooding over the ashes of his empire, and for the first time in his life, he did not bow his head, did not seek approval, did not wait to be told what to do. His voice shook with fury as he shouted, All my life I was your pawn, your failure, your whipping boy. And for what? So you could wear the crown alone while I drowned in your shadow?" My uncle rose, his face twisting with rage and disbelief, barking back that his son was nothing without him, that every breath he had ever taken was a gift from his father's power. But the son was done listening. The storm in his voice grew, louder, his fists slamming the desk, shattering the glass of whiskey that spilled like blood across the papers of old lies. "You built nothing but chains," he screamed. "And now, those chains are broken." My uncle lunged forward, the argument dissolving into violence as decades of resentment and cruelty exploded into raw chaos. Fists, curses, broken furniture, all of it thundered through the house like the wrath of a fallen dynasty tearing itself apart. And I watched, hidden in the shadows, as blood turned against blood. Knowing the war I had started had reached its inevitable end. Not through my hand, but through the destruction they inflicted upon themselves. When the violence had settled into silence, and the house reeked of shattered pride and spilt blood, I stepped out from the shadows like a queen arriving at her coronation. Though what lay before me was no throne, only ruin. My uncle and cousin were broken men, their fury spent, their legacy reduced to nothing but crumbling walls and empty echoes of power. And for the first time, they both looked at me not as the forgotten girl, but as the true architect of their downfall. I could feel their hatred, their fear, their disbelief that the empire they once ruled had fallen into the hands of the very person they had dismissed, underestimated, and betrayed. Standing there, I knew the choice was mine. I could claim the empire, rebuild it brick by brick with my name etched in gold above every door, or I could burn it completely, leaving nothing for history to remember except the tale of how a girl with nothing brought giants to their knees. The temptation to rule was intoxicating, but the fire in my veins whispered of something greater than power. Freedom, vengeance complete, and the chance to walk away not as a prisoner of their world, but as its conqueror. And so, as they glared up at me in disbelief, I declared my victory not in whispers, but in a voice sharp enough to cut through generations. This empire dies tonight, and from its ashes, I will rise. I stood amidst the ruins of their legacy, the vault keys in one hand and the lighter in the other, the weight of two destinies pressing against my chest like iron chains. The vaults held unimaginable wealth: gold, diamonds, offshore accounts, secret deeds to properties scattered across continents. Everything a ruler would need to rebuild a dynasty under her own name. But the lighter, small and fragile, carried a power just as great: the power to end their story forever, to reduce every brick, every paper, every trace of their name into ashes that the wind would scatter. My uncle, bruised and bleeding, spat venom at me, swearing I'd never be more than a thief in the ruins of his crown, while my cousin, broken by betrayal, begged me to spare something, anything, that could allow him to rise again. Their voices were chains pulling me in opposite directions, but I no longer belonged to them, nor to their world. I belonged to myself. My smile was calm, unshaken, as I whispered, "Queens do not inherit thrones. They build their own." And, with that, I pocketed the vault keys, not to preserve their empire, but to strip it bare, to use every stolen coin to forge a kingdom that would never bow to their kind again. Then, without hesitation, I lit the flame and tossed the lighter onto the silk curtains. The fire roared to life, devouring portraits, treasures, memories, erasing their name from history, while I walked away carrying not their empire, but my own beginning. The world woke to whispers of a mysterious figure who had emerged from the ashes of one of the wealthiest dynasties, a woman who walked through fire and came out untouched, her identity unknown, yet her presence undeniable. I moved silently, but with purpose, transferring vault funds into anonymous trusts, reshaping their stolen riches into weapons of influence, buying loyalty where fear had once ruled, and building networks of power that stretched far beyond the borders of a single city. Newspapers speculated about the collapse of my uncle's empire, calling it an implosion of greed, corruption, and betrayal. But in the underworld of finance and politics, they whispered of a woman, the Ghost Queen, who had orchestrated it all. Men in boardrooms feared her, crime lords respected her, and politicians sought her unseen hand. Yet no one knew her face. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was commanding, bending the same world that had once tried to crush me to my own will. And though I had everything I once dreamed of, I never revealed my true name. For I wanted the world to see not Arya, the forgotten girl, but the enigma I had become. The queen who needed no throne, only shadows. The city didn't recognize me at first. To them, I was just another face walking through the smoke of a fallen dynasty. But whispers spread like wildfire, carrying my name into circles that had once barred me from even standing at their doors. I did not arrive with fanfare or crowns, but with quiet precision, investing the stolen wealth into places my uncle and cousin had ignored. The poor districts where ambition burned but opportunity had died. The broken businesses crushed under the weight of their greed. The forgotten families who had been silenced by fear. Each coin I spent was not charity, but a declaration of power, proof that a new force had risen from the ashes. The newspapers called me the Phantom Heiress, the woman who appeared out of nowhere and began reshaping the city's balance of power without ever lifting a sword. I didn't correct them, for mystery was more valuable than truth. Fear of the unknown was stronger than fear of a name. And as I stood in the high tower of a skyscraper I now owned, looking out over a city that had once treated me as invisible, I felt the pulse of something greater than revenge. I felt destiny, raw and alive, whispering that this was only the beginning of a reign no one could challenge. Power is never silent for long, and though the world admired my rise with awe and fear, the ripples of my ascent disturbed predators who had long thrived in the shadows, men who once dined at my uncle's table, syndicates who had traded in blood and money across oceans, and silent partners who had invested in corruption began to stir, whispering my name not with respect but with threat. To them, I was not a queen. I was a usurper, a storm that had dismantled their puppet dynasty and claimed pieces of their wealth without permission. They moved carefully at first, testing me with rumors, hidden warnings, and sudden shifts in markets meant to shake my foundations. But their caution only betrayed their fear. I saw through their veils. They were circling me like wolves, waiting for a moment of weakness. What they did not understand was that I had been raised in the Yisi, den of wolves, torn and remade by betrayal, and I knew their language too well. I welcomed their threats in silence, for each shadow that moved against me was another opportunity to prove that my reign was not built on inherited chains, but on fire and steel. And if they came for me, they would not find a fragile heiress, but the storm that had already burned an empire to the ground. Power, no matter how carefully earned, always breeds enemies, and mine began to rise like vultures circling a battlefield. The old guard, politicians who had once fed from my uncle's hand, rival families who had quietly celebrated his fall, businessmen who thought themselves untouchable, now saw me not as a phantom but as a threat, and threats demand blood. They whispered my name in their hidden councils, calling me a usurper, a thief who had no right to rewrite the city's balance, and in their fear, they forged alliances against me. Anonymous warnings began appearing on my desk. Gunshots cracked in the distance when I left my tower, and rumors spread that assassins had been hired to drag me into the same grave I had dug for my family. But fear did not rattle me. It sharpened me. I had learned from the monsters who raised me that survival was not about strength, but about being 2 steps ahead, and now I used their lessons against their allies. "Let them come," I whispered, to the city that watched me with suspicion and awe. "I am not the heir of an empire. I am its end." And as the shadows closed in, I prepared not just to defend my reign, but to show them that a queen born in fire does not bow to fear. She becomes it. The night of the gala was meant to be my triumph, a display of elegance and control, as I walked into a ballroom dripping with crystal chandeliers and power-drenched eyes. But beneath the polished marble and polite applause, danger coiled like a serpent waiting to strike. I felt it in the subtle hush that followed my arrival, in the nervous glance of a waiter carrying champagne, in the way too many men lingered near the exits with their hands hidden inside their jackets. They thought I was blind, that I was still, the naive girl who once lived in the shadows of stronger men. But they had underestimated the woman forged in betrayal and fire. When the first shot rang out, glass shattered, and screams tore through the hall, chaos exploding around me. Yet my steps did not falter. I moved like I had been waiting for this dance all my life. My guards intercepted 2 of the attackers, but one reached me, blade flashing under the chandeliers, and in that split second, I did not hesitate. With the poise of a queen and the precision of someone who had trained for survival, I turned his momentum against him, the knife clattering, to the floor before his body followed. Silence fell, broken only by the ragged breathing of the terrified guests. And as I stood in the wreckage of their failed assassination, I raised my voice above the fear. Let the city watch and remember. Every strike against me only proves I cannot be broken. In that moment, I was no longer just a phantom. I was a storm. They thought the assassination attempt would frighten me back into the shadows, but fear had long ago burned out of me, leaving only fire. And fire does not retreat. It consumes. Within days, I had traced the attack back to a secret council of men who believed themselves untouchable, gathered in a lavish mansion on the outskirts of the city, where they whispered of strategies and plotted my fall. I did not wait for their next move. I struck first. Disguised power met me at their gates. Armed guards, steel fences, men who had killed for less. But I had come prepared, not just with soldiers loyal to me, but with the kind of ruthless precision my uncle had once ruled with and never imagined I would inherit. The walls of their sanctuary crumbled in fire and chaos as I unleashed a storm that tore through their arrogance. Gunfire echoed, glass shattered, and the so-called kings scrambled like rats in a sinking ship. I walked through the wreckage with unshaken calm, my heels clicking against marble stained with their downfall, until I reached the council table, where their leader knelt, trembling beneath the weight of the empire. He thought he could steal from me. "You wanted a phantom," I whispered as I leaned closer. "But what you have awakened is a queen." And with a single command, I ended their council forever, leaving the city to wake the next morning to headlines of unexplained destruction and whispers that my power was no longer a rumor. It was law. The city was no longer enough to contain my legend. What began as whispers in dark alleys had now erupted into headlines across oceans, my name slipping into boardrooms, embassies, and war rooms where powerful men once thought themselves beyond reach. They called me many things: the Phantom Heiress, the Queen of Ashes, the woman who toppled giants. And while the titles varied, the fear remained the same. I was no longer just a player in a single city's bloody game. I had become a force rewriting the rules altogether. Governments sent envoys draped in false smiles. International tycoons tried to court me with promises of partnership, and intelligence agencies quietly placed me on lists reserved for the most dangerous of enemies. Yet none could deny the truth. Every move I made shifted markets, toppled dynasties, and exposed corruption that had been rotting the world for decades. I had gone from a forgotten girl buried in shadows to a storm that could not be ignored. And as I stood at the balcony of a tower overlooking not just my city, but the horizon beyond, I felt the weight of a choice pressing against me once more. Remain the queen of one kingdom, or extend my reach until the world itself bowed at my feet. The message arrived not through whispers or hidden envelopes, but in the boldest way possible. An explosion that rocked one of my newly acquired shipping hubs, flames clawing at the sky, while the world's media cameras fed on the chaos like vultures. This was no petty rival from the city. This was precise, calculated, and signed with the emblem of a foreign power that had ruled the global underworld for generations. Alongside the destruction came a single package delivered to my private office. Inside it, a black card etched with a single line: "Stay within your borders, or be erased." It was the kind of warning meant to terrify, meant to remind me that even storms can be drowned when oceans rise against them. But as I held that card, my lips curved into a smile, because the fools had made one fatal mistake. They believed I still had borders. My empire had already outgrown the chains of one city. My influence was bleeding into their markets, their politics, their hidden vaults, and they had only just realized it. I burned the card to ash between my fingers, watching the embers fade into the night, and whispered into the silence, "If the world wants a war, then the world shall have a queen." They had drawn first blood on a global stage, but I would not answer with fear. I would answer with silence, precision, and inevitability. While they flaunted their strength with explosions and threats, I slipped into the veins of their empire unseen, dismantling them piece by piece until they bled without realizing where the cuts came from. Their shipping routes collapsed under anonymous audits. Their secret accounts froze overnight as regulators received damning evidence I had planted. Their allies began defecting when I offered them safety, power, or riches beyond what their masters could ever give. I did not strike loudly. I struck like poison, invisible until it was too late. Within months, the global underworld power that had reigned for decades found its foundations crumbling, its leaders scrambling to identify the phantom tearing their empire apart. And when the time came for the final blow, I did not send soldiers or bombs. I sent a broadcast. Across every channel they controlled, my face appeared, calm and unshaken, the world finally seeing not just a whisper or rumor, but the woman behind the storm. "You warned me to stay within my borders," I said, my voice cold and final. "But queens have no borders. I am not your rival. I am your end." And as their screens went dark, so too did their empire, leaving me not as a survivor, not even as a conqueror, but as the name that would forever be remembered as the queen who turned revenge into reign.